During the harsh days of the Great Depression, families were forced to get creative, making every penny scream while somehow managing to serve meals. Today, I am honoring those parents who poured their heart and soul into providing hearty meals for their children. Starting off strong with peanut butter soup. Yes, you heard me right, peanut butter soup. This dish shows just how creative some people were at that time. How could someone even get that idea? You might be wondering. Well, allow me to explain. In the Great Depression era, meat had become quite expensive to bring home. Stretching the budget had become a daily challenge, but peanut butter stepped in. It was rich in protein and full of flavor. This simple ingredient, transformed into a hearty soup, could feed the entire family without breaking the bank. I know it sounds weird. A soup made out of the same peanut butter you'd usually spread on toast. It seems unusual, but when times were tough, it was a genius way to get in some much-needed protein. I don't know about you, but I would definitely try it. It has a bit of charm. A touch of sweetness here, a hint of savory there, and boom! There you have a soup that will keep you fed and happy. It was a good way to use up any odds and ends you had lying around the house. Some onions, peas, rice, or potatoes. Anything you had would serve well once it touched that peanut butter heaven. Dandelion green salad was probably one of the most resourceful dishes to come out of the Great Depression era. The Great Depression was the worst economic downfall in the United States history. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and that marked the beginning of the end for some people. From October 1929 till the end of 1930, America was at a standstill. It's needless to say, people had a hard time putting food on the table while still trying to keep the family members healthy and happy. So, when money was tight and grocery shopping wasn't an option, people had to turn to their own gardens for some free food. You might be thinking to yourself, is there another type of dandelion that I do not know about? And the answer is no, just your regular grow-in-the-park dandelion. What most of us right now consider a park flower or a pesky weed, people considered a nutritious and, even more important, free source of greens back in the day. Dandelions may have a bit of a bitter bite, but you had to work with what nature gave you. So adding some salt and vinegar was a must. And that's all it took to turn these lawn invaders into a Great Depression-era salad. Families would head out with baskets and pick out an enormous amount of dandelions. So, with no grocery list and no checkout lines, people went out and got their ingredients. But hey, not only did they stretch the food budget, but they also kept their lawns clean and fresh. Talk about multitasking. Moving on to something more concrete, Johnny cakes. They could be whatever your heart desired. A main dish, a side dish, something sweet or something salty. They were true soldiers during the tough times. These cornmeal-based pancakes were a lifesaver for families looking to stretch their budgets. With just a few basic ingredients, cornmeal, water, and maybe a dash of salt if you were feeling fancy, you could whip up a batch of Johnny cakes that kept everyone fed without having to pull a bank job. Bread was often too expensive or hard to come by. Johnny cakes were the affordable alternative that could be made from cornmeal, which was widely available and cheap. These little golden cakes were versatile too. You could eat them plain, or drizzled with syrup if you were lucky to have it lying around the house. Johnny cakes were filling and could hold their own as the main course or side dish. Some people might say that they were a bit bland, but what did you expect? A gourmet meal in those times? Johnny cakes were the epitome of resourcefulness. Just cornmeal and water mixed together and fried up on a hot griddle. Simple? Yes. But when you're trying to make every penny count, Johnny cakes got the job done and kept hunger away. Mock chicken legs, a true culinary illusion of the Great Depression. When actual chicken legs were too expensive to buy, people had to get creative, crafting drumsticks out of inexpensive cuts of meat like pork or veal and shaping them to look like the real thing. These so-called legs were then breaded, fried, or baked and served up with high hopes that no one would notice the difference. And honestly, in times as hard as those, nobody even cared which meat they were having, as long as it tasted good and filled you up. The beauty of mock chicken legs is that for a split second, you would forget that it wasn't an actual chicken leg on your plate, rather something that resembled one. It was a brilliant way for families to serve something that felt like a treat without the high cost. Plus, let's give a shout out to all those women who shaped that meat to look like a drumstick. That takes a certain level of dedication. It's a testament to how far people were willing to go to make ends meet while still putting something fun on the table. Mock chicken legs became household favorites, proving that with a little creativity in the kitchen, you could really stretch that budget. When fresh veggies were hard to come by, this simple, affordable dish made its way onto many kitchen tables. Creamed peas on toast. Yuck! Sounds terrible to me, but maybe some of you will disagree. In hard times, this was the go-to meal for families looking for something hearty without draining the pantry. Canned peas, some butter, flour, and milk, and you had yourself a creamy sauce that could turn a humble slice of toast into a meal. I know it doesn't sound glamorous, but creamed peas on toast were the purest form of comfort. You didn't need fancy ingredients or hours of prep time. Toss the peas in a quick white sauce, pour it over toast, and voila, dinner is served. It was filling and warm, with just the right amount of creamines to make you forget that it was actually a can of peas and a piece of toast. Creamed peas on toast came with a great bonus. It was quick to prepare, making it ideal for those nights when you were hungry but didn't have much to work with. It won't win you any culinary awards, but creamed peas on toast was a no-fuss comfort food that got the job done. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, got any canned tuna, that would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. Beans and rice, a dynamic duo that has been filling up bellies for generations. In lean times, this combination was a nutritional powerhouse with protein, carbs, and plenty of flavor, all without costing much. When money was tight, beans and rice were the way to go. They were cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed a whole family with just a few basic ingredients. Another great thing about this meal is its versatility. Got any spices lying around? Throw them in. A sad, lonely veggie waiting to be declared garbage? Throw it in too. It is the meal that will adapt to whatever you had in the house, not the other way around. It always manages to come out tasting like you put more effort into it than you did. Plus, let's be real. When you've got a pot of beans simmering away and some rice cooking on the side, it smells like home, which is what people at the time desperately needed to be reminded of. The beauty of bean and rice is that it is not just a survival meal, it is a comfort food packed with nutrition. While we're on the topic of rice, my personal favorite, rice pudding. A sweet reminder that nothing should go to waste, especially not leftover rice. In the era of the Great Depression, where every rice grain was counted, families found a way to turn yesterday's leftover dinner into today's sweet dessert. Rice pudding became the ultimate budget-friendly treat, transforming something simple into something comforting and sweet with just a little sugar, milk, and a dash of cinnamon if you were feeling particularly fancy. I know leftover rice seems kind of blah, but once it simmers into something that looks and smells like pudding, you'll forget what you were even talking about. Plus, it was an easy way to turn ingredients you had into something new, which saved you money and a trip to the store. It felt like a real treat even in lean times, and that's why it was so popular among families. A warm bowl of rice pudding could brighten up the end of any meal, turning frugality into a moment of indulgence. So even though it started as a way to cut food waste, It stayed a family favorite that warmed up even the coldest hearts in those freezing times. Staying on the theme of no waste or zero waste, whatever you prefer to call it, we've got ourselves split pea soup with ham. When money was tight and meat was a luxury, even the humble ham bone found new life as the star of this hearty dish. Toss it into a pot of split peas, and you've got yourself a soup that could feed the whole family for days. The magic of the soup wasn't in the peas, but in the leftover ham bone, which gave the soup that smoky, rich flavor you could ask for without actually needing any meat. That right there is kitchen creativity at its finest, bringing out every bit of goodness out of something that might have otherwise been thrown away. As the peas simmer and break down, the ham bone starts working its magic and releases all the flavors into the broth. If you were one of the lucky ones, you would catch a few small bits of meat still clinging to it. But never mind if you didn't, the bone still did its job. Corned beef and potato hash was a true Depression-era hero. It was affordable and filling. In a time when fresh meat was hard to come by, corned beef in a can was a lifesaver. Corned beef and potato hash was a shelf-stable, cheap, and stretchy meal. It was a dish that kept bellies full without keeping the wallets empty. The beauty of corned beef hash was in its simplicity. Fry up some chopped potatoes, toss in that canned corned beef, and let it all get crispy in the pan. Adding an onion or two added a bit of spice, but not everyone had that option available. But even if you couldn't afford onions, the combination of corned beef and potatoes was just enough. It was a meal that tasted like you put way more work in than you actually did. It was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed the whole family and still leave enough for leftovers the next day. Corned beef and potato hash wasn't just a Depression-era staple. It was proof that you didn't need fresh ingredients or fancy cooking techniques to make a hearty, filling, and tasty dish on a budget. When times were tough, nothing went to waste, especially not bread. Instead of tossing out stale loaves, families turned them into dumplings to stretch meals further, and tomato soup became the perfect partner for this duo. You'd take some day-old bread, mix it with a little milk and maybe an egg if you had one, and form it into dumplings. Then, plop those into a pot of your regular tomato soup, and you've just transformed a basic dish into something served at restaurants. The bread dumplings would soak up that rich tomato flavor, making every bite feel more flavorful. It was a genius way to avoid food waste and make the most out of what was on hand. Not to mention that tomato soup was already a favorite since it was cheap and easy to make from canned tomatoes. The bread dumplings were just a cherry on top, or dare I say, the dumpling in soup. Together, they created a hearty, satisfying meal that filled you up without costing too much. And that is a win-win in my book. While on the topic of soup, let's not forget to mention onion soup. And since it is fall and fall is the soup-making season, maybe you'll get an idea or two on what to make for your next dinner. The onion soup was proof that even the humblest ingredients could make a delicious meal. In case you didn't know, when you're working on a tight budget, onions become your best mates. They were widely available and quite cheap at the time, so they were the go-to vegetable in hard times. When you mix a few onions and some broth, even if it's just water and a bouillon cube, you'll get yourself a soup that's rich in flavor but light on your wallet. The thing that makes onion soup such a classic and timeless meal is its simplicity. Though caramelizing onions takes a bit of time and patience, they add a depth of flavor that makes you forget you're eating something as simple as soup. Once they hit that sweet golden spot, there's no coming back. With just a few ingredients, you can create something that feels gourmet, even when times are lean. But we can't forget the bread and cheese. No onion soup is complete without them. Traditionally, a slice of bread and a sprinkle of cheese are broiled on top, but even without this fancy finish, onion soup remains a delicacy of this time. What fascinates me about onion soup is that it manages to make an ingredient such as an onion the star of the show, making it into a bowl of comfort that feels like a splurge, even though it is not. Homemade meatloaf, the best-kept secret for stretching a small amount of meat into a full meal. In hard times, buying enough ground beef for the whole family was a challenge, to say the least. But Meatloaf came to the rescue. That makes it sound like a superhero. but in a way it was. The trick was to add breadcrumbs, oats, or whatever filler you had in the house, mix it all up, and you've got yourself a meal that could feed many. Meatloaf was a sort of blank canvas for creative chefs. You could toss in onions, ketchup, or mustard, plus you could top it off with the famous ketchup glaze. The end result was a meal that felt satisfying, even though you'd sneakily cut the meat with cheaper ingredients. The beauty of Meatloaf was that no two recipes were ever the same. Each household had its own version, depending on what they had in the pantry. And let's not forget the most important part, the leftovers. They were good the next day too. Some would say even better. You could slice it up for sandwiches or reheat it for another dinner. It was a comfort food at its finest. Cheap, simple, budget-friendly, and packed with flavor, so you forgot what it actually was. Tracing back to soups for a second, I forgot my favorite one, potato soup. A true staple for when you're on a budget and trying to feed the crowd. With just a few spuds, I can never say that word and not think of Ross dressed as Spudnik in that Halloween episode of Friends. Never mind, allow me to continue. As I was saying, with just a few spuds, some water or broth, and a little milk or cream, you can whip up a pot of creamy soup that will make you feel like you're eating something fancy. Potato soup is as simple as it gets, but that's why everyone loves it. Plus, if you throw in a few onions and carrots, my dears, you've got yourself a true delicacy. Ooh, and don't forget the toppings. Cheese, bacon bits, and green onions can really jazz this dish up. And as all of you probably know, potato soup tastes even better the next day, once all the ingredients get a chance to, as I like to say, get to know each other better. I don't know about you, but this soup is my favorite even today, when it's not made to stretch the family's food budget, but rather to bring some nostalgic feelings around the house. While we're on the topic of potatoes, scalloped spuds, or rather, scalloped potatoes. A dish that takes simple potatoes and makes them into rich, creamy, and cheesy masterpieces. I can put my hand in a fire and say that even the pickiest eaters would turn their heads for this dish. When money was a constant issue, scalloped potatoes became a go-to comfort meal for families looking to make something to impress their guests with. But without spending a fortune, of course. Honestly, who could resist a thinly sliced potato, smothered in a rich and creamy sauce? All you needed in order to make this delicacy was some milk, a little butter, and a sprinkle of cheese. And of course, spuds. Now, what you want to do is layer those thinly sliced potatoes in a baking dish and cover them with sauce. Bake until they turn to that perfect golden color. Here's the fun part. Oh, how amazing a dish is when you can alter it in any way you like. You could add onions, ham, or bacon, or even better, a bit of both. But whatever you choose, you won't be disappointed. Scalloped potatoes will be your best friend in times of need. Now I'm in a mood for something cheesy. Let's talk about mac and cheese casserole. It was one of the ultimate Depression-era comfort foods that has stuck around, and for a good reason. When boxed macaroni and cheese hit the scene, it was an instant hit. It was cheap, easy, and offered that specific taste that made everyone forget in how much trouble they were. Well, at least forget it while at a dinner table. In the Great Depression era, people tried to stretch every dollar, and mac and cheese casserole made that possible. With a little milk and some butter, if you had it, you could make a meal that would make everyone at the table smile from joy, while still remaining on the budget. But the magic started when you turned that everyday mac into a casserole. Toss it in a dish with some breadcrumbs or cracker crumbs and bake until it's golden and crispy. And the same thing goes for this casserole as it did for scalloped potatoes. Get creative with it. If you have Sam ham or bacon, don't be afraid to use it. Make the best out of those leftover peppers. Turn that basic box of pasta into something indulgent. Moving away from the cheesy, creamy dishes, we are now in the turnip and carrot hash territory. Now please listen to this. I know how it sounds, but give it a chance. I mean, our ancestors did eat this at some point in time. It's not inedible. When potatoes were too precious to waste, turnips were the ones who took over their spotlight. During hard times, turnips, these beasts of root vegetables, were everyone's go-to for stretching meals. As for the preparation, there's not much to say. Just chop turnips and carrots, throw them in a pot with some oil, and let them sizzle until they're golden brown. As they cook, their earthy flavors will come together and create the perfect hash. I love a good hash, honestly. This one in particular didn't really catch my eye, But hey, who am I to judge? Maybe it's a once-in-a-lifetime dining experience. Who knows? I think it would taste much better with some meat in it, and our ancestors agreed with that statement. Plus, it's the kind of dish that could easily be turned into a breakfast if you cracked one egg and fired it. So, whether you were craving breakfast, lunch, or dinner, turnip and carrot hash could fill your every desire. While we're on the subject of vegetables, we must mention the classic ragu of vegetables. Ragu of vegetables is a French-inspired stew that is the culinary equivalent of throwing everything together and hoping for the best. Out of all the dishes mentioned, this one is probably the most versatile and surprising. You never truly know what leftovers you have lying around the house, so once you gather them all together in a stew, who knows what you'll make? A few carrots with slight discoloration, a half-rotten tomato, a potato you don't even remember buying. That is what you're working with. But once you chop them all up and throw them in a pot with some broth and herbs, you'll create a bubbly stew in no time. The great thing about ragu is that it is entirely customizable. No two batches will ever be the same, and it's a great way to practice cooking and feel like a gourmet chef. Hey, Gordon Ramsay wasn't born a professional. So next time your vegetable drawer fills up with old veggies, don't just toss them out, but rather make yourself some old-fashioned ragu. Boiled dinner featuring corned beef and cabbage was the ultimate meat stretch of its time. People had to find ways to make a little go a long way, and nothing could to it as good as a boiled dinner. Just imagine that you've got a hunk of corned beef, some cabbage that's, let's be honest, seen better days, and a few potatoes hanging out in the pantry, and voila, dinner is served. Throw everything in one pot, add water, and let it simmer until the meat is tender and the vegetables soften. It is a meal that practically cooks itself, while you sit back and enjoy some quality time with your family, or while you chase your kids around the house. But the leftovers are the real prize. You can turn them into sandwiches and hash, and you can even use the leftover broth for a new soup. This boiled dinner is the perfect reminder that with just a bit of creativity, you can whip up a delicious meal even when money is tight. Fried cornbread, or as some like to call it, hoe cakes, was a Southern staple during the Great Depression that made every meal a bit more enjoyable. When you didn't have much, cornbread was the thing that came to the rescue. It was simple, affordable, and made with ingredients most people had on hand: cornmeal, water, maybe a bit of buttermilk if you were one of God's favorites. Plus, if you throw it in a hot skillet with some oil, you could turn those ingredients into some crispy, golden, and irresistible bites. Fried cornbread was often served with soups or beans, two other Depression-era staples, as you've learned by now. Together, they made a hearty, filling meal that could stretch for days. And I don't know about you, but that crispy cornbread edge is something that always makes my mouth water. Dip it into a bowl of soup or pile on some beans, and suddenly a modest meal feels a little more special. And let's be real, anything fried instantly ups the comforting factor. I mean, just take a look at Kentucky Fried Chicken. Would they be as popular if they were Kentucky boiled chicken? I don't think so. Navy bean soup was one of the Depression-era lifesavers, especially when it came to those government surplus food boxes handed out to families in need. In times when options were limited, a bag of Navy beans came in hand and saved the day. These little white beans might not look like much, but when simmered in a big pot with some water and maybe a bit of ham or bacon, they transformed into a soup of your dreams that could feed a family for days. Navy beans are packed with protein, and they could fill you up and leave you satisfied, which was exactly what families in need were craving in those hard times when meat was scarce and expensive. The longer it simmered, the better it tasted, which meant you could make a big batch on Monday and still be eating it on Thursday, with the taste just getting better and better. Even with minimal ingredients, Navy bean soup delivered with the taste. It was humble, yes, no one can disagree on that, but it did what it had to do. Plus, if you had some bread or crackers, this dish could fill you up with warmth and make those hard days a bit more bearable. Circling back to soups for a second, let's talk about egg drop soup. This is one of those incredible dishes that somehow manages to be elegant and simple at the same time. It was inspired by Chinese cuisine, and it had become a go-to meal for many families during tough times because it required so few ingredients but still managed to deliver a good amount of nutritional value. All you needed was broth, 1 or 2 eggs, and a bit of green onions. The great thing about egg drop soup is that the preparation doesn't take up much of your time. You heat the broth up and gently whisk in some beaten eggs. Even though eggs seem like the star of the show, the actual star is the broth, since it makes those eggs into something that will keep those bellies happy. Egg drop soup was perfect for families trying to use up any ingredients they had in the house. Whether served as a starter or as a main dish with a side of rice or vegetables, it brought a taste of something new to the table. It was simple, affordable, and downright comforting when comfort was all any of our ancestors were looking for in the era of the Great Depression. Homemade biscuits with gravy, a dish fit for a royal family or a very, very hungry family. Flour, baking powder, milk, and a little butter come together to create these golden biscuits that are the perfect vehicle for gravy. And don't get me started on the gravy. A little flour, fat, and some milk or broth whisked together created a rich, creamy sauce that turned biscuits into a hearty breakfast or dinner. Back in the day when the budget was tighter than ever, biscuits were practically a lifesaver, or at least a budget saver. They tasted even better if you had Sam's sausages or bacon sitting around, but even if you didn't, this meal was always a crowd pleaser. But whether you were serving them as a breakfast or a light dinner, these biscuits were going to keep your tummy happy and satisfied, and they hit just the right spot. This dish still to this day serves as a friendly reminder that a little can go a long way if prepared and served with love. Get ready to be amazed. Potato pancakes, yes, potato. They are the definition of taking something as simple as a potato and making it into something crispy and golden, a true masterpiece. There were a lot of potato-based dishes in this video, and here's why. Potatoes were widely available during tough times since they were quite easy to grow and distribute. Flour, on the other hand, was not. These little fried patties were an easy solution without having to rip your hair out in the grocery store. All you really need is a few potatoes, some flour, an egg, and a little oil for frying. And suddenly you've got a meal that's both budget-friendly and delicious. An added bonus of these little pancakes is that they could be served as breakfast, lunch, and dinner, plus a midnight snack for those of us who have late-night cravings. Potato pancakes are as adaptable as you want them to be. Top them off with anything that you have, applesauce or sour cream if you're feeling traditional. However you serve them, you won't be wrong. Potato pancakes were a Depression-era staple for good reason. Inexpensive, easy to make, and satisfying, they turned humble spuds, as Ross would say, into a comfort food classic. Whether you served them with eggs or just plain, they were going to keep you fed. That's a guarantee. To end off with a classic, let me tell you something about spaghetti with tomato sauce. Spaghetti was, and still is, the classic go-to meal for when you want to prepare something cheap but still crowd-pleasing. During tough times, canned tomatoes became a pantry staple that could transform into sauces, soups, and stews. Basically, they played a superhero in their story. When it came to stretching the budget, spaghetti was truly unbeatable. The preparation is not that different from today, but let me show you anyway. Firstly, you want to simmer those canned tomatoes with some garlic and maybe an onion if you like, and boom, there's the sauce. It doesn't take much to make this dish great and a family favorite. Toss in some dried herbs for extra flavor, and sprinkle a bit of Parmesan if it is a special occasion, and all of a sudden you've got yourself a fancy meal that costs you pennies, but would cost you big bank in Italy. It was as satisfying as it was affordable. You could feed an entire family for the price of a few canned tomatoes, and that was truly beautiful in those times. Plus, it was versatile enough to adapt to whatever else you had lying around. Spaghetti with tomato sauce was good proof that great food doesn't have to be expensive. If these budget-friendly meals remind you of the Great Depression, hit like and subscribe. Share your favorites in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going.